She was buried in a cave in Croatia roughly 42,000 years ago, and for a long time, no one thought to ask whether anyone had loved her. Her bones were catalogued, her age was estimated, her species was confirmed by a laboratory thousands of miles from the cave where she died. But the question of whether a Neanderthal woman named, for convenience, Vindija 33.16 had ever been desired, missed or grieved by another person did not appear in the early scientific papers. Science does not usually ask that question. It asks what can be measured. And for over a century, what could be measured about Neanderthals seemed to answer the question already, without anyone needing to ask it. They looked different enough, scientists assumed, that nothing like love could have crossed the line between their kind and ours. Then her DNA told a different story. Somewhere inside the genetic code recovered from that cave, and from others like it across Europe and Western Asia, researchers found something that should not have existed if Neanderthals and modern humans had simply passed each other in the landscape without consequence. They found sequences of Neanderthal DNA sitting quietly inside the genomes of living people today, not as a fossil curiosity, as an active, inherited, functioning part of human biology. Somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago, and likely at several points afterward, a Neanderthal person and a modern human person did what living things do when they are near each other long enough. They had children, and some of those children survived, grew up, and had children of their own, carrying a small, permanent thread of Neanderthal ancestry into the future. That fact alone rewrote a chapter of human history, but it left the harder question untouched. A shared child does not prove a shared feeling. Biology can explain a pregnancy. It cannot, by itself, explain a bond. This is the story of what the evidence can and cannot tell us about that bond. It follows the physical traces left behind by encounters between two kinds of humans who were closely related, who could produce children together, and who lived side by side in parts of Europe and Asia for thousands of years before one of those kinds disappeared. It follows the skeletons that show signs of a shared life. It follows the genetic evidence that reveals not just that mixing happened, but roughly how often and under what circumstances. And it follows the researchers who have spent decades trying to separate a scientifically defensible claim about ancient partnership from a romantic story invented to fill a silence. Because the honest answer sits somewhere between two extremes that are equally tempting and equally wrong. One extreme insists that Neanderthals were near animals, incapable of anything resembling human attachment, and that any mixing with our ancestors must have been coercive, opportunistic, or meaningless. The other extreme imagines a prehistoric romance, complete with courtship and heartbreak, projected backward from modern love stories onto people who left us no letters, no images of their faces turned toward each other, no direct record of affection at all. The truth that the evidence actually supports is quieter than either extreme, and in some ways more remarkable. It involves care that left physical marks on bones. It involves a genetic signature that tells us mixing was not a single accident, but a repeated pattern across tens of thousands of years and multiple regions. It involves a Neanderthal population that was, by the time modern humans arrived in large numbers, already small, already isolated, and already carrying the biological cost of generations of inbreeding, a detail written directly into their DNA. And it involves modern humans who inherited genetic material that still shapes immune response, skin, hair, and even mood regulation in people alive today, whether they know it or not. To understand what actually happened between these two kinds of humans, you have to start where the bones were found. A cave above a river valley. A woman who lived, ate, was injured, healed, and eventually died there, surrounded by evidence of a group that cared for its members long after they could no longer contribute much physical labor. And you have to follow the story forward, generation by generation, encounter by encounter, until it reaches the genome of someone alive today, quietly carrying pieces of a species that vanished more than 35,000 years ago. Before you continue, think for a moment about your own family. Somewhere in it, there is very likely a story about two people from different backgrounds, different languages, or different communities who found each other anyway, and whose children carried both histories forward without ever fully belonging to just one. If your ancestry traces outside of sub-Saharan Africa, that same pattern reaches back much further than you might expect. It reaches back to a different kind of human entirely. What did that first meeting actually look like, and what can we honestly say about what it meant to the people involved? The evidence does not give a simple answer. It gives something better. It gives a path laid down in stone tools, in isotopes, in healed bones, and in DNA that lets us trace, step by careful step, exactly how close two different kinds of humans came to each other, and exactly where the proof of affection ends and the proof of survival begins. Geneticists working on this question are not guessing. When they compare a Neanderthal genome, first fully sequenced from bone fragments found in a different cave in Croatia, against the genomes of thousands of living people, they can see precisely which segments of modern DNA came from a Neanderthal ancestor and which did not. The segments are not evenly spread. Some regions of the modern genome carry almost no Neanderthal ancestry at all, because those genetic combinations proved harmful and were removed by natural selection over thousands of generations. Other regions carry Neanderthal ancestry so consistently that scientists believe it must have offered some advantage, something that helped modern humans survive in unfamiliar environments that Neanderthals already knew intimately after several 100,000 years of living in them. That distinction matters enormously for the story ahead. It means the mixing between these two populations was not random noise, quickly erased by time. It was filtered, generation after generation, the way any inherited trait is filtered by whether it helps or harms survival. Some Neanderthal genes helped modern humans face new diseases, new climates, and new foods. Others caused problems significant enough that natural selection spent tens of thousands of years quietly editing them out of the human genome. The fact that any Neanderthal ancestry survives at all after that much filtering tells us the mixing must have happened often enough, and successfully enough, to leave a durable mark. Chapter 1. A species that refused to stay buried. For most of the 20th century, the story of Neanderthals was written by people who had never met one, working from bones that could not speak for themselves, and the story they told was almost entirely negative. The first widely publicized Neanderthal skeleton, found in a valley in Germany in 1856, was reconstructed by a scientist who assumed the bent posture of an elderly man suffering from arthritis was simply how the entire species stood. That single misreading created an image, hunched, brutish, dim-witted, that took more than a century to undo. Cartoons, museum displays, and textbooks repeated the same slouching, club-carrying figure for generations, long after better evidence had already begun to contradict it. The correction did not come from a single dramatic discovery. It came slowly, from dozens of excavation sites across Europe and Western Asia, each one adding a small piece of evidence that Neanderthals had been underestimated. They made tools with real skill, adapting their technology to local stone and local prey. They controlled fire deliberately, not opportunistically. They buried their dead in ways that suggest deliberate treatment of the body, not simple abandonment. Some sites show possible evidence of symbolic behavior, though researchers remain divided on how much meaning to read into scattered pigments, marked shells, or arranged objects. And in cave after cave, researchers found skeletons of Neanderthal individuals who had survived injuries that should have killed them without sustained help from other people. By the time genetic technology advanced enough to extract usable DNA from Neanderthal bone in the early 2000s, the scientific picture of who Neanderthals were had already shifted considerably. They were no longer treated as a failed evolutionary experiment. They were treated as a separate, closely related population of humans, adapted with remarkable success to cold climate Europe and parts of Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years, far longer than modern humans have currently existed as a species at all. Part of what drove this reassessment was a growing body of evidence for Neanderthal hunting skill and adaptability that had nothing to do with the interbreeding question at all, but that mattered enormously for establishing the baseline competence any theory of Neanderthal social behavior would eventually need to account for. Analysis of animal bones found alongside Neanderthal tools at numerous sites shows clear evidence of organized, large-game hunting, including coordinated pursuit of animals as large and dangerous as woolly rhinoceros and straight-tusked elephant, prey that would have required group cooperation, planning, and considerable physical courage to hunt successfully with the close-range weapons available to Neanderthal hunters. Wear patterns on Neanderthal weapon tips, along with evidence of healed injuries consistent with close-quarters hunting trauma found across multiple Neanderthal skeletons, support the picture of a population engaging directly and repeatedly with dangerous prey, rather than relying primarily on scavenging, an older theory that dominated the field for much of the 20th century before more detailed taphonomic analysis of butchered animal remains overturned it. This matters to the present investigation because organized, cooperative big-game hunting of this kind requires exactly the kind of sustained social coordination, trust, and division of labor that also underlies the capacity for long-term social bonds more broadly. A population capable of planning, executing, and surviving repeated hunts against dangerous megafauna was not a population operating on instinct alone. It was a population capable of complex social organization, extending across the hunt itself and, almost certainly, into the broader network of relationships, including caregiving relationships, that made repeated successful hunting possible across many generations. That long survival makes their eventual disappearance, sometime between 40 and 35,000 years ago, one of the central mysteries in human history. And the genetic discoveries of the past 2 decades have complicated that mystery rather than resolving it. Because Neanderthals did not simply vanish. Part of them stayed. The pivotal moment came in 2010, when a research team led by geneticist Svante Paabo, working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from bone fragments recovered at Denisova Cave in Croatia. The technical achievement alone was extraordinary. DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments, and ancient DNA is almost always contaminated with genetic material from bacteria, fungi, and the many humans who have handled a bone since it was excavated. Extracting a usable ancient genome required new laboratory techniques built specifically to separate authentic ancient sequences from modern contamination, and to stitch together millions of tiny fragments into something resembling a complete genetic blueprint. When the team compared that reconstructed Neanderthal genome against the genomes of living people from different parts of the world, they found something unexpected. People whose ancestry traced outside of Africa carried small but consistent traces of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 2% of their total genome. People whose ancestry traced entirely within sub-Saharan Africa did not carry that same signature, or carried it at much lower levels, reflecting later migration patterns rather than direct Neanderthal contact. The pattern told a specific, testable story. Modern humans originated in Africa. At some point, some of those modern humans migrated out of Africa and into regions where Neanderthals already lived. Somewhere in that overlap, sometime between about 65,000 and 47,000 years ago, according to the genetic dating, the two populations mixed. And that mixing was successful enough, biologically, that it left a permanent signature in the descendants of the modern humans who left Africa. A signature still detectable in billions of people alive today. This was not a fringe finding. It was published in the journal Science, subjected to intense scrutiny by geneticists around the world, and confirmed by multiple independent research teams using different genomes, different statistical methods, and different Neanderthal fossils from different sites. Subsequent research, including detailed genome comparisons published by researchers such as Sriram Sankararaman and David Reich, refined the picture further, mapping exactly which regions of the modern human genome carry Neanderthal ancestry and which do not. The confirmation mattered because the claim itself was, in a sense, biologically surprising. Neanderthals and modern humans had been evolving along separate paths for several 100,000 years before they mixed again. That is an enormous amount of separated evolutionary time. Many animal species become reproductively incompatible after far less separation than that. The fact that Neanderthals and modern humans could still produce fertile offspring after so long apart tells researchers something important about how closely related the two populations actually were, despite their physical differences in build, brow structure, and adaptation to climate. It also raised the question this documentary exists to investigate. A successful pregnancy requires biological compatibility. It does not require affection, courtship, or anything resembling what a modern audience would recognize as a relationship. The genetic evidence proves contact happened, and proves it happened often enough to leave a lasting mark. It does not, by itself, prove what that contact felt like to the people involved, or whether it happened through anything resembling mutual choice. To answer that harder question, researchers had to look past the genome and back toward the physical world where these encounters actually took place. They had to ask where Neanderthals and modern humans would have crossed paths, how long those overlaps lasted, and what daily life in a mixed or bordering community might actually have required of the people living it. That investigation starts not with DNA, but with geography, and with a period of overlap in Europe and Western Asia that lasted far longer than most people assume. Current dating evidence places modern humans arriving in the Levant, the region spanning modern Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, by at least 180,000 years ago, based on fossil evidence from sites including Neanderthova Cave. Neanderthals were also present in that same region across an overlapping span of time, moving in and out of the area as climate shifted. That means the two populations were not strangers meeting for the first time in a single dramatic encounter somewhere in Europe. They had chances to encounter each other, retreat, and encounter each other again across more than 100,000 years, long before the genetic evidence suggests the interbreeding that shows up in living human DNA actually took place. That earlier contact matters, because it establishes something important before any question of intimacy can even be raised. These were not two alien species meeting for the first time under conditions of total unfamiliarity. By the time the genetically confirmed mixing occurred, modern humans and Neanderthals had likely encountered each other's tools, camps, and possibly each other's people across many previous generations. Whatever eventually happened between them did not happen in a vacuum. It happened after a long, uneven, geographically scattered history of proximity. The technical difficulty of even reaching this point in the research deserves a moment of attention, because it explains why the interbreeding question remained essentially unanswerable for so long, and why the answer, once it arrived, carried so much scientific weight. Ancient DNA is fragile. A living cell protects its DNA constantly, repairing damage as it happens. The moment an organism dies, that repair stops, and the DNA inside every cell begins breaking down, attacked by its own enzymes, by bacteria, by water, and by simple chemical decay. Within a few thousand years, most of the DNA in a bone has been reduced to fragments only a few dozen letters long, a fraction of the length needed to read a gene in its normal, complete form. Parbo's team spent years developing methods specifically to deal with this problem. Methods that involved sequencing millions of these tiny fragments separately and then using computer algorithms to determine how they overlapped, reconstructing something resembling a complete genome the way a torn photograph might be reassembled from thousands of scattered pieces, without ever being fully certain in advance that enough pieces had survived to complete the picture. They also had to solve a second, equally serious problem. Every bone that has been excavated, handled, transported, and stored in a museum or laboratory carries DNA from every person who touched it, and often from bacteria and fungi that colonized it during burial. Distinguishing genuine 40,000-year-old Neanderthal DNA from a lab technician's own DNA, deposited accidentally through a cough or a fingertip, required building entirely new cleanroom laboratory protocols, the kind more commonly associated with handling dangerous pathogens than analyzing bone fragments. This context matters for how much weight the eventual finding deserves. When the 2010 paper announced that living humans outside Africa carried Neanderthal DNA, it was not a casual conclusion drawn from a quick comparison. It was the product of years of methodological development specifically designed to eliminate the possibility of contamination or statistical error, producing a false positive result. The finding has since been confirmed and refined using dozens of additional Neanderthal genomes recovered from other sites, using improved laboratory techniques, and using comparison against increasingly large databases of modern human genomes from populations around the world. It is, by the standards of ancient DNA research, about as thoroughly verified as a finding of this kind can currently be. This history, laid out from the cave floors of the Levant to the river valleys of Europe, forms the necessary foundation for everything that follows in this investigation. And it is worth stating plainly why that foundation matters before moving forward. Every subsequent chapter in this documentary rests on the fact that the genetic evidence for interbreeding has been checked, rechecked, and independently confirmed by multiple laboratories using multiple methods, rather than resting on a single team's initial claim. That level of confirmation is unusual in a field where dramatic, headline-generating claims sometimes outrun the strength of the underlying evidence. And it is part of why this particular finding, more than almost any other in Neanderthal research, can be treated as a stable, reliable foundation for the harder, more uncertain questions this documentary asks in every chapter that follows. Two populations closely enough related to produce fertile offspring after several 100,000 years of separate evolution moved through overlapping territory across an enormous span of time, leaving behind a scattered trail of shared and adjacent living sites long before the genetic proof of interbreeding was ever recovered from a laboratory. The next chapter follows that trail more closely, into the specific landscapes where the physical evidence of proximity is clearest, and where the ordinary, practical logic of small human populations sharing a hard, resource-limited world begins to explain why contact between the two kinds of humans was less an improbable accident and more a predictable consequence of geography. Chapter 2. The Land. Both of them called home. Picture a valley in what is now northern Israel, roughly 70,000 years ago. A river cuts through limestone hills. Caves open along the slopes above the water, offering shelter from wind, rain, and the animals that hunted at night. This kind of landscape, water, shelter, and access to game, was valuable to every human population that has ever existed, and it did not go unclaimed. At different points across many thousands of years, both Neanderthals and modern humans used caves in this same region. Sometimes the same cave was used by one population, then abandoned, then used again generations later by the other. Sometimes they occupied the same broader valley system in overlapping periods. Excavations at sites including Neanderthal Cave and School Cave have produced modern human remains dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, while nearby sites such as Taboon Cave and Kabara Cave have produced Neanderthal remains from periods both before and after that modern human presence. The Levant, in other words, functioned as a genuine frontier zone, a region where the territories of two different human populations pressed against each other repeatedly across an enormous span of time. A frontier like this does not guarantee friendly contact. It does not guarantee hostile contact either. What it guarantees is proximity, and proximity is the minimum condition required for anything else to happen. Without shared or adjacent territory, none of the questions this documentary is investigating would even be possible to ask. The genetic evidence proves that at some point, proximity turned into something closer. The archaeological evidence in the Levant establishes that the opportunity for that closeness existed across a timescale long enough to make repeated encounters plausible rather than freakishly rare. The nature of that opportunity becomes clearer when you consider how small human populations actually were during this period. Genetic estimates suggest Neanderthal populations across their entire range in Europe and Western Asia may have numbered in the low thousands to low tens of thousands at any given time, spread thin across an enormous territory. Modern human populations moving out of Africa were similarly small in the earliest waves of migration. Neither population had the numbers to avoid the other indefinitely across shared or bordering land. Small, mobile groups following seasonal resources, tracking migrating animals, moving between known water sources, were almost certain to cross paths with other small, mobile groups doing the same thing, whether those groups belonged to their own population or not. This is where the physical evidence becomes essential, because it lets researchers move past assumption and into something closer to reconstruction. Stone tool technology offers one of the clearest signals. For most of their long history, Neanderthals produced a distinctive toolkit known to archaeologists as the Mousterian industry, characterized by a specific method of preparing a stone core before striking off flakes of a controlled, predictable shape. Modern humans arriving in Eurasia generally carried different technological traditions, though the picture becomes considerably more complicated in the final tens of thousands of years before Neanderthal disappearance. In several regions, most notably in parts of France and northern Spain, archaeologists have identified a transitional tool industry known as the Châtel-Perronian, found at sites including the Grotte du Rennes in Arcy-sur-Cure. This toolkit combines elements of traditional Neanderthal technology with techniques and ornament styles more commonly associated with modern human toolkits from the same general period, including pierced animal teeth and bone tools that suggest personal ornamentation. For decades, researchers debated fiercely whether the Châtel-Perronian represented Neanderthals independently developing more complex technology and symbolic behavior on their own, or whether it represented Neanderthals learning from, trading with, or otherwise directly interacting with nearby modern human groups. The debate has never been fully resolved, and it remains one of the genuine open disagreements in Neanderthal research. Some researchers, pointing to the sophistication of the ornaments and their similarity to modern human material culture from the same period, argue the Châtelperronian is best explained by direct contact and cultural exchange between the two populations. Other researchers argue Neanderthals were capable of developing symbolic behavior independently, without needing to borrow it from modern humans, citing evidence of pigment use and possible ornamentation at Neanderthal sites that predate confirmed modern human presence in the same regions. Both positions rest on real evidence. Neither position is settled beyond reasonable dispute. What matters for this investigation is not which side of that debate eventually wins. What matters is what the debate itself reveals. Even researchers who disagree about the cause of the Châtelperronian agree on the underlying fact that makes the debate possible at all. In at least some regions, during at least some periods, Neanderthal groups were geographically close enough to modern human groups, for long enough, that their material cultures began to resemble each other. Whether that resemblance came from direct teaching, trade, observation across a shared landscape, or independent invention, it could not have happened at all without sustained physical proximity measured in generations, not single encounters. A separate but related line of evidence comes from ornamental objects found at several Neanderthal sites across Europe, including eagle talons bearing cut marks consistent with deliberate removal for use as pendants or ornaments, identified at sites including Krapina in Croatia, where the talons have been dated to significantly before the period of confirmed modern human presence in the region, and more recently at additional sites analyzed by researchers including Davorka Radovčić. This evidence suggests Neanderthals were capable of producing symbolic ornamentation independently of any modern human influence, at least in this specific case, which complicates any simple narrative in which Neanderthals passively absorbed all symbolic behavior from contact with modern humans. It suggests instead a more genuinely mutual picture, in which both populations, when they did come into contact in places like the Châtelperronian sites in France, were meeting as two independently capable, independently symbolic populations, rather than one population simply teaching an entirely blank slate. That proximity is the necessary foundation for everything the rest of this documentary investigates. It does not, on its own, prove affection. A shared landscape does not require a shared bed. But it does establish something the genetic evidence alone cannot. It shows that the conditions for repeated, ongoing contact between these two populations existed across multiple regions and multiple time periods, not as a single improbable accident, but as an ordinary feature of life in the borderlands, where two related human populations pressed against each other for tens of thousands of years. To understand how ordinary this kind of proximity likely was, it helps to think about how both populations actually moved through their environment, rather than imagining them as static occupants of fixed territories with clean, permanent borders. Neither Neanderthal nor early modern human groups in this period lived in one place year-round. Both were highly mobile, following the seasonal movement of prey animals, shifting camp locations as water sources dried up or froze, and returning to favoured caves and rock shelters that offered reliable shelter across multiple seasons or multiple years. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal teeth and bones, which can reveal information about diet and sometimes about the geographic range an individual moved across during their lifetime, indicates many Neanderthal groups ranged across territories covering many tens of kilometers, following herds of horses, deer, bison, and other large game animals that themselves moved seasonally in response to changing vegetation and climate. Modern human groups arriving in the same broader regions followed similar strategies out of similar necessity. Survival in an Ice Age landscape required following resources, not claiming a single fixed territory, and defending it indefinitely against all others. This mobility means the borders between Neanderthal and modern human territory, to whatever extent such borders can even be meaningfully described for populations without fixed settlements, were not static lines on a map. They shifted with the seasons, with the movement of prey, and with the availability of water and shelter, creating a landscape where two different populations pursuing the same resources in the same general region were likely to overlap repeatedly across a single year, let alone across the many centuries during which both populations occupied the same broad geographic zone. This pattern of overlapping, resource-driven movement also helps explain the specific archaeological sites where evidence of contact appears strongest. Caves and rock shelters near reliable water sources, in landscapes that supported large herds of game animals across multiple seasons, functioned as natural convergence points, locations any mobile group in the region would eventually need to use, regardless of which population they belonged to. A cave that offered the best available shelter within a day's travel of a reliable water source did not stop offering that shelter because a different kind of human had used it the previous season. Sites like Kebara Cave and Taboon Cave in the Levant, discussed earlier in this chapter, sit within exactly this kind of high-value, resource-rich landscape, which is precisely why both populations return to them repeatedly across many thousands of years, creating the kind of layered, alternating occupation pattern that archaeologists have documented at both locations. Climate shifts during this period added further pressure toward convergence rather than separation. The period spanning roughly 100,000 to 40,000 years ago included multiple significant climate fluctuations, some pushing colder, ice-adapted environments further south into regions modern humans were simultaneously expanding into from Africa, and some pushing warmer conditions further north into regions Neanderthals had previously occupied more exclusively. Each significant climate shift would have forced both populations to adjust their range, sometimes contracting into smaller, more concentrated territories as previously usable land became less habitable, a process that, rather than keeping the two populations apart, likely pushed them into closer and more frequent contact precisely during the periods when resources were most constrained and the stakes of any given encounter, friendly or otherwise, were highest. The next question is what that contact actually looked like at the individual level, when it moved past shared landscapes and shared tool styles into something involving actual bodies, actual relationships, and actual children. That question takes the investigation to a specific cave in Siberia, and to a single bone fragment that would eventually prove interbreeding was not a rumor written into modern genomes from a safe genetic distance, but something that had happened within a single family, within living memory, to a specific person whose remains researchers would eventually be able to identify by name. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Was Both. In 2012, researchers excavating in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia recovered a small bone fragment, roughly 2 centimeters long, from a layer of sediment dated to approximately 90,000 years ago. It was unremarkable to look at. Archaeologists initially could not even determine from shape alone which species it belonged to or which part of the skeleton it had come from. Genetic analysis eventually identified it as a fragment of long bone, likely from a limb, belonging to a girl who had died at roughly 13 years old. Standard ancient DNA analysis at the time was designed to identify a specimen's species by comparing it against known reference genomes, Neanderthal, Denisovan, or modern human. When researchers at the Max Planck Institute ran the comparison on this fragment, in a study led by Viviane Slon and published in 2018, the results did not cleanly match any single category. Instead, the genome showed roughly equal contributions from 2 distinct ancestral populations. Her father's genetic contribution matched the Denisovans, a population of archaic humans identified primarily through DNA from this same cave, closely related to Neanderthals, but genetically distinct. Her mother's genetic contribution matched Neanderthals. She was, in the most direct sense the term can be used, a first-generation hybrid. Not a distant descendant carrying a diluted trace of mixed ancestry inherited many generations back, the way most living humans carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA today. An actual child, born to one Neanderthal parent and one Denisovan parent, whose bone fragments survived by chance in a cave sediment layer for roughly 90,000 years before a research team recovered it and sequenced it well enough to identify her parentage with confidence. The researchers gave her the informal name Denny. Her discovery was reported in the journal Nature, and it remains one of the most direct pieces of evidence available anywhere in the archaeological or genetic record for interbreeding between different archaic human populations. It moved the entire question out of statistical inference and into something close to a birth certificate. Before Denny, the case for interbreeding rested on comparing whole population genomes and detecting patterns consistent with historical mixing, a powerful but indirect form of evidence. Denny was different. She was a single individual whose two parents belonged to two different, genetically distinguishable populations of archaic humans. The math did not require modeling across thousands of years. It was visible directly in her genome, split almost exactly down the middle. The statistical improbability of this discovery is worth pausing on because it speaks directly to how rare a find like Denny actually is, and how much confidence it deserves as a result. Denisova Cave has produced only a handful of identifiable Neanderthal, Denisovan, and hybrid remains across decades of careful excavation, from sediment layers representing tens of thousands of years of intermittent human occupation. Finding a single bone fragment that happens to belong to a first-generation hybrid individual among the relatively small number of identifiable bone fragments recovered from the site overall suggested to the research team that first-generation mixing between Neanderthals and Denisovans may have been considerably more common than the rarity of the physical evidence alone would suggest. Since the odds of preserving and correctly identifying a first-generation hybrid specifically, rather than a more common, more distantly related individual, are relatively low under any scenario where mixing was a rare, isolated event. Viviane Slon's team explicitly noted this statistical logic in their published analysis, suggesting that if hybrid individuals were extremely rare, finding one in such a small sample of recovered remains would itself be a notable coincidence, and that a more parsimonious explanation is that mixing between these populations, at least in this specific region of Siberia, was a regular enough occurrence that hybrid individuals, while still uncommon, were not vanishingly rare within the broader population. Her discovery also answered, indirectly, a question this documentary has been building toward. A single hybrid individual, born from one Neanderthal and one Denisovan parent, does not by itself prove love in any sense a modern audience would recognize. It proves biological compatibility, and it proves that at least one encounter between these two populations at some point roughly 90,000 years ago in or near the Altai Mountains resulted in a child who was carried to term, born, and lived long enough to leave physical remains behind. What researchers can say, based on further genetic work on the broader Denisovan and Neanderthal genomes recovered from the same cave system, is that Denny was not an isolated accident. Her father's genome itself showed evidence of Neanderthal ancestry from several generations earlier, meaning mixing between these two populations had already happened at least once in his own family history before he had Denny. That detail matters enormously. It shifts the picture away from a single freak encounter and towards something closer to an ongoing pattern, at least in this particular region, across at least a few generations. It is worth pausing here on what the evidence does not claim, because the temptation to fill in the emotional details of Denny's parents' relationship is strong, and the protocol under which this investigation operates requires resisting that temptation. Researchers do not know how Denny's parents met. They do not know whether the relationship between a Neanderthal woman and a Denisovan man, two populations that were themselves already somewhat genetically diverged from each other, involved anything resembling mutual choice, prolonged partnership, or single encounter. They do not know whether Denny's mother remained with her Denisovan partner, whether Denny was raised within a Neanderthal group, a Denisovan group, or some mixed community, or what happened to her after the age of roughly 13, when the bone fragment identifying her was deposited in the cave sediment. What they do know, and what the evidence supports without speculation, is narrower but still significant. Two different, geographically overlapping populations of archaic humans, each with their own distinct evolutionary history stretching back several 100,000 years, were close enough to each other, often enough, that individual pairings between them produced children who survived to adolescence. That survival itself required more than a single successful pregnancy. It required a group willing to raise a child whose parentage crossed a boundary that, by every visible physical and cultural marker available to the people around her, would likely have been obvious. Denisova Cave itself supports this picture of a genuinely mixed or overlapping community across a long span of time. The cave contains sediment layers spanning hundreds of thousands of years, and DNA recovered from dirt alone without requiring an identifiable bone fragment at all, using a technique called sedimentary ancient DNA analysis, pioneered in part by researchers including Matthias Meyer, has detected the genetic signatures of Denisovans, Neanderthals, and eventually modern humans moving through the same physical space across different periods. This was not a single meeting point visited once. It was a location used, abandoned, and reused by different and sometimes overlapping human populations across an enormous stretch of time, making repeated contact and repeated opportunities for interbreeding, considerably more plausible than a single chance encounter model would suggest. It is worth explaining, briefly, who the Denisovans actually were, since they remain considerably less well known to a general audience than Neanderthals, despite playing an equally significant role in this story. Denisovans are known almost entirely through genetic evidence, rather than substantial skeletal remains, a genuinely unusual situation in paleoanthropology. The population was first identified in 2010, the same year as the landmark Neanderthal genome paper, when researchers sequenced DNA from a small finger bone fragment found in Denisova Cave and discovered it belonged to neither a Neanderthal nor a modern human, but to a previously unknown, genetically distinct population of archaic humans. Since that initial discovery, only a small handful of additional Denisovan physical remains have been identified, including a jawbone recovered from a cave on the Tibetan Plateau, identified through analysis of ancient proteins by a team led by Frido Welker, since the specimen contained no surviving DNA. This means Denisovans are, in an important sense, a population defined by their genome rather than by a well-documented physical form, making Denny's remains, however fragmentary, an unusually valuable direct physical link to a population researchers otherwise know almost entirely through indirect genetic traces. The geographic range suggested by this genetic evidence is considerably broader than the single cave where the population was first identified. Denisovan ancestry appears at meaningful levels in the genomes of modern populations across parts of Asia and Oceania, with particularly high percentages, sometimes reaching 4 to 6% of total ancestry, found in populations native to Papua New Guinea, Australia, and other parts of Melanesia. This distribution suggests Denisovans occupied a range extending across a significant portion of Asia, potentially including regions considerably warmer and more tropical than the cold Siberian mountains where their remains were first identified, a possibility supported by genetic evidence of Denisovan-derived genes helping modern Tibetan populations adapt to high altitude. Low oxygen environments, most notably a gene called EPAS1, studied in detail by researchers including Rasmus Nielsen and Emilia Huerta Sanchez, which appears to have entered the modern Tibetan gene pool directly through Denisovan interbreeding and continues to provide a measurable survival advantage at high altitude today. This broader context matters because it means Deni's parents were not simply two isolated individuals from small, geographically confined populations meeting by rare accident. They were representatives of two archaic human populations that had, based on the wider genetic evidence, each independently developed patterns of interbreeding with other human populations across a wide geographic range. Neanderthals with modern humans, as this documentary has already established, and Denisovans with modern human populations ancestral to present-day Melanesians and other Asian groups, as later chapters will touch on. Deni's existence sits within this wider pattern of archaic human populations that were, across the board, more genetically permeable and more willing or able to interbreed with related but distinct populations than researchers assumed before the genomic era of anthropology began. Deni's existence transforms the abstract genetic statistics discussed in the first two chapters into something that can no longer be treated as a distant population-level curiosity. It places a specific, physical, 13-year-old girl at the center of the story, a girl whose body was, in the most literal biological sense, the direct result of contact between two different kinds of ancient humans. Whatever that contact meant to the people involved, and however it began, it did not end in rejection or abandonment severe enough to prevent a mixed child from surviving into adolescence within a group capable of caring for her. That single fact, modest as it sounds, carries more weight than it might first appear, and the next chapter follows the evidence for exactly what kind of care ancient human groups, Neanderthal groups specifically, were capable of providing to their most vulnerable members, long before any question of interbreeding enters the picture at all. Chapter 4. The man who should not have survived if Deni's genome proves that Neanderthals were capable of producing children with a related population, a different set of remains, found more than 4,000 miles away in northern Iraq, proves something arguably more important to the question this documentary is asking. It proves what Neanderthals were capable of doing for each other, for reasons that had nothing to do with reproduction at all. Neanderthal Cave, in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, has produced the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals since excavations began there in the 1950s under archaeologist Ralph Selecki. Among them, one skeleton, catalogued as Shanidar 1, has become one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the entire debate over Neanderthal social behavior. The man, who died at an estimated age between 40 and 50, an advanced age for a Neanderthal given the physical demands and dangers of the environment, carried a catalogue of injuries that would have made independent survival close to impossible. His right arm showed evidence of a severe injury sustained many years before death, so severe that the arm had likely been withered, partially paralyzed, or possibly amputated below the elbow. His skull showed evidence of a healed fracture above the left eye, along with hearing damage consistent with bony growths in the ear canal that researchers, in analysis published by Eric Trinkhaus among others, have linked to conditions that would have caused significant hearing loss. His right leg showed a healed fracture and evidence of a degenerative condition affecting the joint, likely causing a pronounced limp. None of these injuries individually would have been fatal on their own. Together, sustained by a single person over the course of years, they would have severely limited his ability to hunt, to travel long distances without assistance, to defend himself, and potentially to hear approaching danger. And yet the bones showed clear evidence of healing, meaning he did not die from these injuries. He lived with them, in some cases for many years, before dying from causes researchers have not been able to determine with certainty from the skeleton alone. The scientific significance of Shanidar 1 lies precisely in that survival. In a small mobile group dependent on hunting and gathering in a mountainous, resource-limited environment, a severely disabled adult male represents a significant ongoing cost. He would have required food he could not fully gather or hunt for himself. He may have needed help moving between camps. He would have been more vulnerable to predators and less able to contribute to group defense or provisioning. His survival to an age well beyond what many uninjured Neanderthals reached is difficult to explain without concluding that other members of his group provided him with sustained material support, likely across a period of years, not days or weeks. This is not a claim about romantic love, and researchers examining Shanidar 1 have generally been careful not to frame it that way. It is a claim about something arguably more foundational to the question this documentary is investigating: the demonstrated capacity of Neanderthal social groups to extend care toward members who could offer little or nothing in immediate physical return. That capacity, once established, becomes directly relevant to the interbreeding question, because it tells us something about what kind of social environment a mixed ancestry child or a partner from a different population might plausibly have been received into. Shanidar 1 is not an isolated case. Skeletal analysis across multiple Neanderthal sites has identified other individuals who survived significant injury or illness for extended periods before death. A Neanderthal skeleton recovered at La Chapelle aux Saints in France, first described in the early 20th century and reanalyzed with modern methods by researchers including Trinkhaus, showed severe arthritis, tooth loss, and evidence of a spine that had likely made upright movement difficult and painful in the years before death. A skeleton from La Ferracie showed similar evidence of an aging, physically limited individual who nonetheless survived. Taken together, these cases form a pattern rather than a single anomaly. Neanderthal groups across multiple sites and multiple time periods were repeatedly capable of sustaining members whose physical condition made them a net cost rather than a net contributor to group survival, at least in the narrow economic sense of hunting and gathering output. Researchers disagree, and this is a genuine, ongoing scholarly disagreement rather than a settled fact, about how much weight to place on this evidence. Some argue it demonstrates something close to compassion in a form recognizable to modern humans, a willingness to care for the vulnerable regardless of immediate benefit. Others argue for a more cautious interpretation, suggesting that group survival strategies, food-sharing norms, and social bonds built through cooperation over many years could explain sustained care without requiring us to project a specifically emotional, modern concept of compassion onto Neanderthal social structure. Both interpretations are consistent with the physical evidence. The bones show that care happened. They cannot, on their own, tell us precisely what internal experience motivated the people providing it. A useful way to think through this disagreement is to consider the practical mechanics of what sustained care for someone like Shanidar 1 would actually have required, day to day, across the likely years he survived, with a withered arm, a limp, and significant hearing loss. Someone would have needed to save a portion of hunted meat or gathered food for him when he could not fully provide for himself. Someone would have needed to help him move between camps during seasonal relocations, likely slowing the group's travel pace to accommodate his reduced mobility, a real cost in an environment where staying near reliable resources often meant the difference between survival and starvation for the whole group. Someone would have needed to remain alert to threats on his behalf, given his reduced hearing, effectively extending their own vigilance to cover a gap in his. None of this requires inventing an emotional vocabulary the evidence cannot support. It requires acknowledging that these were not small, casual accommodations. They were sustained, costly, repeated choices made collectively by a small group across years to keep a severely disabled member alive and included, rather than leaving him behind when his physical usefulness to the group had clearly and permanently declined. What the evidence does allow, responsibly, is a narrower and more useful conclusion. Neanderthal social groups were structurally capable of sustained, costly investment in individual members over years, not just moments. That structural capacity is the necessary precondition for anything resembling a long-term bond, whether between two Neanderthals, between a Neanderthal parent and a hybrid child like Denny, or, as the next chapter investigates, between a Neanderthal individual and a modern human they may have encountered, lived alongside, or partnered with during the tens of thousands of years the two populations shared overlapping territory across Europe and Western Asia. Neanderthal Cave produced one additional piece of evidence that became, for a period, one of the most famous and most debated claims in the entire field of Neanderthal research. Pollen analysis of the sediment surrounding one burial, catalogued as Shanidar 4, identified concentrations of pollen from several flowering plant species, leading Selecki and his original research team to propose in the 1960s that the burial had been accompanied by flowers deliberately placed with the body, a finding that entered popular culture as evidence of Neanderthal ritual, symbolic thought, and emotional depth, and that was widely cited for decades as proof that Neanderthals grieved their dead in ways directly comparable to modern human funeral practices. More recent analysis has substantially complicated this claim. Later researchers, including a re-examination led by Chris Hunt and colleagues, raised serious questions about whether the pollen could have entered the burial sediment through natural means, including transport by burrowing rodents known to collect seeds and plant material in underground caches, a behavior well documented in the specific rodent species found active in the cave's sediment layers. This does not mean the flower burial claim is definitively false, but it means the evidence is genuinely more ambiguous than the popular version of the story suggests, and responsible researchers today generally treat the flower burial as an unresolved, contested claim rather than settled proof of Neanderthal ritual behavior. This example matters for how this documentary approaches every piece of evidence discussed throughout the investigation. The flower burial claim became popular partly because it offered a satisfying, emotionally resonant story. Neanderthals mourning their dead with flowers, gathered and placed with intention. That satisfaction is exactly the kind of pull this documentary has committed to resisting when the underlying evidence cannot fully support it. The healed injuries of Shanidar 1, by contrast, remain far better supported, because healed bone leaves a form of evidence that cannot easily be explained by rodent activity or natural sediment disturbance. A fractured skull that shows clear evidence of bone remodeling and healing did, unambiguously, heal, and that healing did, unambiguously, require the individual to survive long enough afterward for the bone to repair itself, a process that in humans typically takes many weeks, at minimum for even a straightforward fracture, and considerably longer for the kind of severe, multiple injuries Shanidar 1 sustained. The question the investigation now turns to is whether this same demonstrated capacity for sustained care extended across the boundary between Neanderthals and modern humans specifically, or whether the genetic evidence of interbreeding represents something closer to isolated, opportunistic contact, without the sustained social investment visible in cases like Shanidar 1? The answer requires looking not at Neanderthal sites alone, or modern human sites alone, but at the small, contested handful of locations where evidence from both populations appears close enough together, in time and space, to suggest genuinely shared or directly adjacent community life. Chapter 5. Counting the generations back. A genome does not just tell researchers whether two populations mixed. Under the right analysis, it can tell them roughly when, and in some cases, how many separate times. The method relies on a simple biological fact. When a Neanderthal and a modern human had a child together, that child inherited one long, continuous segment of Neanderthal DNA from the Neanderthal parent, mixed alongside modern human DNA from the other parent. But DNA does not stay in long, continuous segments across generations. Each time a person has a child, the chromosomes they pass on are shuffled through a process called recombination, breaking long ancestral segments into progressively smaller pieces with every generation that passes. This means the length of surviving Neanderthal DNA segments in a modern genome functions almost like a genetic clock. Long, unbroken segments of Neanderthal ancestry indicate a relatively recent mixing event because there has not been enough time for recombination to break the segment into smaller pieces. Short, scattered segments indicate an older mixing event because many generations of recombination have had time to fragment the original inherited block. Using this method, a research team led by Svante Parbo and Priya Morjani analyzed the genome of a modern human skeleton discovered at Peștera Cuase in Romania, an individual who lived approximately 40,000 years ago. The result, published in a 2015 study, was striking. This individual carried Neanderthal DNA in segments so long that the researchers calculated he likely had a Neanderthal ancestor within the previous 4 to 6 generations, meaning a great-great-grandparent or great-great-great-grandparent. This was not a case of ancient, diluted ancestry inherited from a mixing event tens of thousands of years earlier. This was a person whose family tree included a direct Neanderthal relative within living memory of people he likely knew personally. The Oase individual's own lineage, interestingly, does not appear to have contributed significantly to later European populations based on later genetic comparisons. He represents what researchers describe as a genetic dead end, an early wave of modern human migration into Europe that mixed with Neanderthals, but whose direct descendants did not persist in large numbers into later populations. This detail matters because it demonstrates something important about the pattern of interbreeding overall. It was not a single founding event whose consequences trace in an unbroken line to everyone alive today. It appears to have happened multiple times, in multiple places, involving different modern human populations at different points during their expansion out of Africa and across Eurasia. Further genetic analysis, comparing Neanderthal ancestry patterns across modern populations in East Asia, Europe, and South Asia, has reinforced this picture of multiple, separate contact events rather than one. East Asian populations today carry somewhat higher average levels of Neanderthal ancestry than European populations, a pattern that puzzled researchers until further analysis suggested it likely reflects at least one additional pulse of interbreeding that specifically affected the ancestors of East Asian populations, separate from and later than the mixing event or events that affected the ancestors of Europeans. Research led by scientists including Benjamin Verneau and Joshua Akey has worked to map these separate pulses with increasing precision, using large genomic datasets to distinguish ancestry inherited from genuinely distinct interbreeding events, rather than a single shared origin. The emerging picture, still being refined as new ancient genomes are recovered and sequenced, suggests interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans was not a single rare accident that happened once, somewhere, and then never again. It was closer to a recurring feature of contact between the two populations, occurring independently in different regions across a span of at least 15 to 20,000 years, wherever and whenever modern human groups expanding out of Africa encountered Neanderthal groups already established in Europe and Western Asia. This matters directly to the question of what these encounters actually involved, because a single accidental event and a recurring pattern across multiple regions and multiple millennia support very different interpretations. A single isolated event could plausibly be explained by almost any circumstance, coercive or otherwise, without requiring us to say much about the general nature of contact between the two populations. A recurring pattern happening independently in the Levant, in Europe, and separately affecting the ancestors of East Asian populations is much harder to explain without concluding that modern humans and Neanderthals were, across a substantial period of shared or bordering territory, in regular enough contact and biologically compatible enough that reproduction between them happened as a normal, if presumably still relatively uncommon, feature of life along their shared frontier. It does not tell us whether any specific instance of that reproduction involved affection, coercion, opportunism, or something else entirely, and researchers examining this evidence are careful to say so. Genetics cannot recover consent, courtship, or emotional state. What genetics can recover, with increasing precision, is pattern, frequency, and timing. And the pattern that has emerged over the past decade of research points toward repeated, geographically distributed contact, rather than a single freak occurrence, which is itself a significant correction to how this question was often framed in the earlier years of Neanderthal genetic research, when a single ancestral mixing event was still the leading hypothesis. A further refinement of this dating method deserves attention, because it illustrates how much more precise this field has become in a relatively short span of years. Early estimates of when interbreeding occurred relied primarily on comparing broad, population-level patterns of Neanderthal ancestry across many modern genomes, producing a wide date range spanning tens of thousands of years. More recent work, including a detailed 2020 study led by Benjamin Verneau, analyzing genomes from a broader, more geographically diverse set of ancient and modern individuals, has narrowed that range considerably by directly measuring segment length decay across genomes of known age, including ancient modern human genomes recovered from sites across Europe and Asia that themselves predate the Oase individual discussed above. This layered approach, comparing segment lengths not just between ancient and modern genomes, but across a whole sequence of ancient genomes spanning different time periods, allows researchers to track how Neanderthal ancestry segments shortened progressively over tens of thousands of years, essentially watching the genetic clock tick forward across multiple snapshots in time, rather than inferring the whole history from a single comparison. The results have consistently supported a primary interbreeding period, concentrated between roughly 50 and 55,000 years ago, likely in the region spanning the eastern Mediterranean and southwestern Asia, with the additional later, more geographically localized pulses affecting East Asian ancestry and the Oase individual's very recent Neanderthal ancestor, representing separate, secondary events layered on top of that primary period. This precision matters for the investigation because it narrows the window during which the most significant, population-defining contact between the two populations took place to a specific, identifiable period, rather than leaving it spread vaguely across tens of thousands of years. A concentrated period of primary contact, occurring during a specific window when modern human populations were first establishing themselves in territory Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years, points toward a specific kind of encounter, a frontier period, likely lasting several thousand years, during which the two populations were in closest and most sustained contact, before modern human populations expanded further and Neanderthal populations began the long decline, traced later in this documentary. It is worth situating this frontier period within the broader picture of modern human migration out of Africa, since the interbreeding event did not happen to a single isolated population, but to the specific wave, or waves, of modern humans whose descendants eventually populated the rest of the world outside Africa. Genetic and archaeological evidence indicates modern humans made several attempts to expand beyond Africa across a long span of time, with some earlier expansions, including the population represented by remains found at School and Kafsa in the Levant, discussed in Chapter 2, apparently not surviving as a continuous lineage into later populations. The specific expansion whose descendants do populate the world today, and whose genomes carry the Neanderthal ancestry traced throughout this documentary, appears to have moved out of Africa sometime after roughly 70,000 years ago, entering the same general Levantine and southwestern Asian region, where the primary interbreeding period, identified by Verneau's team and others, is now estimated to have occurred. This alignment between the timing of the successful modern human expansion out of Africa and the timing of the primary Neanderthal interbreeding event is unlikely to be coincidental. It suggests the specific modern human population that would go on to populate Europe, Asia, and the Americas was, during the earliest and most vulnerable phase of its expansion into unfamiliar Eurasian territory, in close and sustained enough contact with local Neanderthal populations to both exchange genetic material and, quite possibly, to benefit from the practical, on-the-ground knowledge Neanderthals had already accumulated about surviving in these landscapes, knowledge that would not have been recorded anywhere except in lived experience, and, if the language evidence discussed in a later chapter is taken seriously, in whatever degree of direct communication passed between the two populations during this critical window of first sustained contact. The next chapter turns to a harder and more uncomfortable question raised by this pattern of repeated contact, one that researchers have increasingly had to confront as the genetic picture has become more detailed. The direction of that mixing was not symmetrical, and the genetic evidence for exactly who was mixing with whom and what that asymmetry might mean complicates any simple, comfortable narrative about equal partnership between the two populations. Chapter 6. A pattern that is not symmetrical. One of the most consistent findings in Neanderthal genetics is also one of the least comfortable to sit with, and it complicates any simple story about mutual, symmetrical partnership between the two populations. No modern human mitochondrial DNA has ever been found in any sequenced Neanderthal genome. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, unchanged except by occasional mutation, generation after generation. If Neanderthal men had regularly had children with modern human women, and those children had been raised within Neanderthal communities, researchers would expect to find modern human mitochondrial DNA showing up in at least some Neanderthal remains. They do not find this. Every Neanderthal genome sequenced to date carries exclusively Neanderthal-type mitochondrial DNA. At the same time, modern human genomes today carry no Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA either, despite carrying meaningful percentages of Neanderthal ancestry elsewhere in the genome. Combined with additional evidence from the Y chromosome, passed exclusively from father to son, where researchers have found no evidence of Neanderthal Y chromosome lineages surviving in modern human populations, a specific pattern emerges. The interbreeding that left a lasting genetic mark on humanity appears to have flowed in a particular direction. Neanderthal genetic material entered the modern human population primarily, and perhaps overwhelmingly, through Neanderthal fathers and modern human mothers, or through pairings where the resulting children were raised within modern human, rather than Neanderthal, communities. This finding, detailed in research including work by Fernando Mendes, Carlos Bustamante, and later analysis incorporating fuller Y chromosome and mitochondrial datasets, does not mean interbreeding never occurred in the other direction. It means that if it did, those lineages did not survive into the deep future, either because they were rarer, because children of Neanderthal mothers were less likely to be integrated into surviving modern human populations, or because of reduced fertility or viability, specifically in that direction of pairing, a possibility some researchers have raised given broader patterns of reduced hybrid fertility, often observed between closely related but distinct species and subspecies elsewhere in the animal world. This is where responsible interpretation has to slow down considerably, because the temptation to fill this asymmetry with a single, simple explanation runs in several different, contradictory directions, and the evidence does not clearly support any one of them over the others. One possible explanation involves reduced hybrid fertility, specifically affecting one direction of pairing more than the other, a pattern documented in various animal hybrids where offspring of one parental direction are less fertile or less viable than offspring of the reverse pairing, a phenomenon geneticists call Haldane's rule. If something similar affected Neanderthal modern human hybrids, it could explain the asymmetric survival of genetic lineages without requiring any explanation involving social behavior, choice, or coercion at all. This explanation is taken seriously by researchers, including in analysis published by Kelly Harris and Rasmus Nielsen, examining reduced fitness in certain regions of hybrid genomes, but it remains one hypothesis among several, not a settled conclusion. A second possible explanation involves social structure. If modern human groups expanding into Neanderthal territory were larger, on average, or more numerous than local Neanderthal groups by the later periods of contact, children resulting from any direction of pairing might have been more likely, simply as a matter of demographic probability, to end up integrated into modern human communities rather than Neanderthal ones, regardless of which parent belonged to which population. Population size estimates suggest Neanderthal groups were, by the final tens of thousands of years before their disappearance, considerably smaller and more fragmented than the modern human populations expanding into their territory, which would support this kind of demographic explanation, independent of any assumption about the nature of individual relationships. A third possible explanation, and the one that requires the most caution, involves the possibility of unequal or coercive dynamics in some proportion of these encounters, a possibility researchers cannot rule out, and generally do not claim to have ruled out, but also cannot confirm from genetic evidence alone. Genetic data cannot recover consent. It cannot distinguish a child born from within an accepted, integrated partnership from a child born from an encounter involving unequal power between two different, unevenly sized populations occupying contested territory. Responsible researchers, including those most directly involved in generating this genetic evidence, have generally avoided claiming the asymmetry proves coercion, while also avoiding the opposite overcorrection of assuming it proves universal romantic partnership. The honest position, and the one this documentary maintains, is that the evidence permits several explanations, that they are not mutually exclusive, and that the true picture across tens of thousands of years and multiple separate regions almost certainly involved a range of different circumstances rather than a single uniform pattern repeated identically everywhere. What the asymmetry does responsibly rule out is the simplest, most romantic reading of the genetic evidence. The idea that interbreeding straightforwardly reflected mutual, symmetrical partnership between the two populations in every instance. It does not rule out that some proportion of these encounters involved genuine, sustained partnership. The evidence from Denis's parentage, discussed earlier, at minimum establishes that a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, populations that mixed in something closer to the reverse direction pattern seen later between Neanderthals and modern humans, produced a child who survived long enough to leave physical remains, which required some form of sustained care, regardless of how the pairing itself began. The evidence for reduced hybrid fertility deserves closer examination because it represents one of the more technically detailed findings in this entire field, and one that speaks directly to the biological reality underlying the asymmetry. When researchers examine the specific regions of the modern human genome where Neanderthal ancestry is almost entirely absent, they found these regions cluster heavily around genes active in sperm production and testis function, along with a large portion of the X chromosome. This is a pattern with a well-established precedent in evolutionary biology. Haldane's rule, first described by biologist J.B.S. Haldane in 1922 and confirmed across dozens of studied species since, observes that when two closely related but distinct species or subspecies hybridize, it is very often the heterogametic sex, the sex carrying two different sex chromosomes rather than two matching ones, that experiences reduced fertility or viability in the resulting offspring. In humans and most mammals, males are the heterogametic sex, carrying one X and one Y chromosome, which would predict that male hybrids resulting from Neanderthal and modern human interbreeding may have faced reduced fertility more often than female hybrids. A pattern consistent with the observed depletion of Neanderthal ancestry, specifically on the X chromosome and in testis-linked genes. This does not mean male hybrids never existed or never had children of their own, only that natural selection appears to have worked against that specific genetic combination more consistently over many thousands of generations, gradually reducing the presence of Neanderthal ancestry in exactly the genomic regions most closely tied to male reproductive function, while leaving Neanderthal ancestry more intact in other regions of the genome not linked to this specific fertility pressure. Researchers, including Kelly Harris, have used population genetic modeling to estimate that this selection pressure was strong enough to explain a meaningful portion of the overall pattern of reduced Neanderthal ancestry seen across the modern human genome today, working alongside the social and demographic explanations discussed above rather than replacing them entirely. It is worth being direct about why this level of detail matters to a documentary about whether Neanderthals fell in love, rather than treating it as an unrelated scientific tangent. A story that stopped at the emotionally satisfying finding of interbreeding without following the evidence into its more complicated and less comfortable details would not be telling the full story the evidence actually supports. The asymmetry, the reduced hybrid male fertility, and the demographic pressure of a shrinking Neanderthal population meeting an expanding modern human one are not footnotes to the interbreeding story. They are central to understanding what kind of contact was actually possible, and under what constraints, between two populations whose biological compatibility, while real, was not unlimited. The demographic explanation for the asymmetry deserves slightly more attention as well, because it offers a path toward understanding the pattern that does not require assuming anything negative about the nature of individual relationships. If Neanderthal group sizes were, as the evidence in Chapter 8 will establish in more detail, considerably smaller than modern human group sizes by the period of most intense contact, then a Neanderthal community absorbing a modern human partner, whether male or female, alongside any children that resulted, would represent a much larger proportional shift for that Neanderthal community than the reverse situation would represent for a larger modern human community absorbing a single Neanderthal partner and their children. Simple demographic math, in other words, may make integration into the larger population more statistically likely regardless of which direction any specific pairing began in, without requiring an explanation rooted in choice, coercion, or preference at all. Researchers have not been able to fully separate this demographic explanation from the biological Haldane's rule explanation, using genetic evidence alone, and the true answer, as with much of this investigation, may well involve both factors operating simultaneously rather than a single clean cause. A further complication worth noting is that the asymmetry itself may not have been uniform across the entire period and geographic range of contact. The Oasi individual discussed in Chapter 5, with a Neanderthal ancestor within just 4 to 6 generations, does not by himself tell researchers which sex that ancestor was, since the specific genetic markers used to trace maternal and paternal lineage were not fully recoverable from his degraded ancient genome. This means it remains genuinely possible that the broad asymmetric pattern observed across the aggregate of many modern human genomes today conceals individual exceptions, specific encounters, or specific family lines where the direction ran the other way, but whose genetic traces did not happen to survive the tens of thousands of years of subsequent selection and genetic drift that have shaped the modern human genome since. Absence of surviving evidence for a reverse direction lineage is not the same as proof that no such lineage ever existed. The genetic asymmetry, in other words, complicates the story without resolving it in either direction. It is exactly the kind of evidence a documentary following genuine research must include, even though it resists a comforting conclusion. The next chapter turns to skeletal evidence that offers a different kind of clue, not about the direction of genetic flow, but about what daily physical life looked like for individuals whose ancestry and whose bones blur the line between the two populations more directly than statistical genetic analysis alone can show. Chapter 7. A child buried with both ancestries. In 1998, archaeologists excavating a rock shelter at Lagar Velho in the Lepedo Valley of Portugal uncovered the burial of a child, roughly 4 years old, dating to approximately 24,000 years ago. The burial itself was careful and deliberate, the small body covered in red ochre, accompanied by pierced shell ornaments and the remains of a rabbit placed near the head. Details consistent with intentional, respectful treatment of the dead observed at other burial sites from this period across Europe. What made the discovery scientifically significant was not the burial ritual, but the skeleton itself. The excavation team, led by archaeologist João Zilhão, working alongside Eric Trinkhaus, described a combination of skeletal features that did not cleanly match either a typical modern human child or a typical Neanderthal child from this period. The child's lower limb proportions, particularly the relatively short shin bone relative to the thigh bone, resembled a pattern more commonly associated with Neanderthal skeletal structure than with modern human children from the same broad period. Other features, including aspects of the jaw and chin, appeared more consistent with modern human anatomy. Trinkhaus and Zilhão interpreted the skeleton as possible physical evidence of mixed Neanderthal and modern human ancestry, either directly, through a recent Neanderthal ancestor within a few generations, or through a longer history of population mixing in the region reflected in the child's build. This interpretation, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, was immediately and remains genuinely contested. Other researchers, including Ian Tattersall and Jean-Jacques Hublin, argued the skeletal features could fall within the normal range of variation for a modern human child of that age and period. without requiring an explanation involving Neanderthal ancestry at all, given the genuine difficulty of assessing precise skeletal proportions in a still-growing child's skeleton. This disagreement has never been fully settled through skeletal analysis alone, and it illustrates an important limitation in this kind of evidence that this documentary has been careful to acknowledge throughout. Skeletal morphology, the study of bone shape and proportion, can suggest ancestry, but it cannot confirm it with the same precision as direct genetic analysis, particularly in children, whose skeletons are still developing and whose proportions naturally vary more than fully mature adult skeletons. Attempts to extract usable ancient DNA from the Lagar-Velho child's remains to resolve the debate directly have so far not produced conclusive results due to the poor preservation of genetic material in remains from this region and climate. The methodological disagreement over the Lagar-Velho child also reflects a broader, ongoing tension within the field of Neanderthal research more generally, between researchers who favor a more expansive interpretation of ambiguous evidence in favor of interbreeding and mixed ancestry, and researchers who favor a more conservative interpretation requiring stronger, more direct proof before accepting a mixed ancestry claim. Both positions serve a legitimate scientific function within the field. Researchers favoring the more expansive interpretation help ensure that genuine evidence of mixing is not overlooked or dismissed prematurely due to excessive caution, while researchers favoring the more conservative interpretation help guard against the field overstating its confidence in cases where alternative, non-hybrid explanations remain genuinely plausible. This documentary has tried, throughout, to represent both sides of contested claims like this one honestly, rather than presenting the more dramatic or more emotionally satisfying interpretation as though it were the settled scientific consensus, when in cases like the Lagar-Velho child, no such consensus currently exists. What the Lagar-Velho child does contribute to this investigation, even without full genetic confirmation, is a second, independent line of evidence pointing in the same general direction as the genetic data discussed in earlier chapters. By approximately 24,000 years ago, well after the primary period of genetically confirmed interbreeding, roughly 47 to 65,000 years earlier, communities in Iberia may still have carried, and shown in their physical development, meaningful traces of mixed ancestry. Iberia is a particularly relevant region for this question because genetic and archaeological evidence suggests some of the last surviving Neanderthal populations in Europe persisted in the Iberian Peninsula later than in most other regions, potentially as recently as around 40,000 years ago, based on dating from sites including Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar. If Neanderthal populations did persist longer in Iberia, and if modern human populations expanding into the region encountered these late surviving groups, additional, more recent interbreeding in this specific region becomes plausible, separate from, and later than, the primary mixing events reflected in most modern human genomes today. The Lagar-Velho child, whatever the final resolution of the ongoing morphological debate, sits within a region and a time period where this kind of later, more localized mixing is at least geographically and chronologically consistent with other evidence. Equally important to this investigation is what the burial itself communicates, regardless of how the ancestry debate is eventually resolved. A 4-year-old child, whatever combination of ancestry contributed to the skeleton's unusual proportions, was buried with the same careful, deliberate treatment, the same ochre, the same ornamentation, and the same food offering that characterizes other respected burials from this period and region. There is no evidence in the burial itself of exclusion, difference in treatment, or marking of the child as separate from the community that buried them. If the skeletal interpretation favoring mixed ancestry is correct, the burial suggests that a child of mixed Neanderthal and modern human descent was, at minimum, integrated fully enough into a modern human community to receive the same respectful burial practices given to other members of that group. This detail connects directly back to the evidence discussed in Chapter 3, involving Denny, the first-generation Neanderthal-Denisovan hybrid, whose bone fragments survived in Denisova Cave. Both cases, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, point toward the same underlying pattern. When mixed ancestry children are found in the archaeological and genetic record, the surrounding evidence, whether skeletal survival to adolescence in Denny's case, or careful, resourced burial in the Lagar Velho child's case, suggests these children were not uniformly rejected or abandoned by the communities around them. They were, in at least these documented instances, raised or at minimum treated with the same care given to other children, long enough to leave behind physical evidence of that care. The Lagar Velho child is not the only skeleton where researchers have proposed possible mixed ancestry based on physical features, and it is worth briefly surveying the wider evidence to show how this line of investigation extends beyond a single contested case. The Oasi-1 skull, belonging to the same roughly 40,000-year-old individual whose genome revealed a Neanderthal ancestor within 4 to 6 generations, discussed in Chapter 5, also shows several skeletal features that researchers, including Trinkhaus in a separate morphological analysis published alongside the genetic findings, describe as unusual for a typical modern human of the period, including aspects of the molar teeth and certain proportions of the skull that fall closer to the range typically associated with Neanderthal anatomy. In this case, unlike the Lagar Velho child, the genetic evidence directly confirms recent Neanderthal ancestry, allowing researchers to treat the unusual skeletal features with considerably more confidence as a genuine physical signature of that mixed heritage, rather than relying on morphology alone, as they were forced to with the Portuguese child. This combination, a skeleton with unusual features and a genome directly confirming recent Neanderthal ancestry in the same individual, is significant because it gives researchers a calibration point. It shows what mixed ancestry actually looked like in skeletal terms in at least one confirmed case, which in turn lends indirect support to the interpretation of other skeletons, including the Lagar Velho child, that show broadly similar unusual features without direct genetic confirmation. It does not resolve the specific debate over the Portuguese child, but it does make the mixed ancestry interpretation considerably more plausible than it would be if no directly confirmed comparison case existed at all. Burial practices across this period, more broadly, offer one additional piece of context worth including here. Careful, resourced burial involving grave goods, ochre, and deliberate body positioning was not universal or automatic during this period for either Neanderthals or modern humans. Many individuals from both populations, based on the archaeological record, appear to have been disposed of with far less evident ceremony, whether through simple burial without grave goods, or in some cases, through means that left no clearly identifiable burial site at all. This makes the instances of careful, resourced burial that do survive, including Shanadar I's group in the previous chapter and the Lagar Velho child here, stand out as evidence of particular significance or particular relationship rather than routine universal practice applied automatically to every death. A child buried with ochre, ornamentation, and a food offering was a child whose death mattered enough to the surviving community to warrant that specific, resource-intensive response, a detail that strengthens rather than weakens the interpretation that this child, regardless of the ancestry debate, was valued by the people who buried them. None of this proves romantic partnership between the parents involved. It does not resolve the asymmetry discussed in the previous chapter, or answer whether every individual encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans involved anything resembling mutual choice. But it adds a specific, physical, regionally grounded piece of evidence to a picture that, chapter by chapter, is building toward a more complicated and more human conclusion than either the coldly biological framing of early genetic papers or the romanticized framing of popular retellings has generally allowed. Somewhere between those two extremes, in a rock shelter in Portugal and a cave in Siberia, separated by continents and tens of thousands of years, two mixed ancestry children were, by the clearest evidence available, cared for. The investigation now turns to a different, equally important piece of the puzzle, one that moves the story away from individual children and toward the broader population-level pressures that may have shaped why interbreeding happened, when and where it did, including the increasingly well-documented genetic evidence that Neanderthal populations, by the final tens of thousands of years of their existence, were already in serious biological trouble. Chapter 8. A population running out of itself. The Neanderthal genome recovered from Denisova Cave, the same one used in the landmark 2010 study establishing interbreeding, revealed something else, something that had nothing directly to do with modern humans at all, and everything to do with why interbreeding may have mattered so much when it did happen. Genomes carry evidence of their own population history, written into patterns of genetic diversity. A population with a large, stable number of individuals across many generations tends to show high genetic diversity, because many different ancestral lineages contribute to the gene pool. A population that has gone through repeated bottlenecks, periods where the number of breeding individuals dropped sharply, tends to show reduced diversity, and specifically tends to show longer stretches of the genome where the two copies of a gene, one inherited from each parent, are identical, a pattern called runs of homozygosity. Long runs of homozygosity are a direct genetic signature of inbreeding, indicating that an individual's parents were closely related. When researchers analyzed the Denisova Neanderthal genome for this signature, and later confirmed the pattern using additional Neanderthal genomes recovered from other sites including Denisova Cave and a cave in the Caucasus Mountains, they found levels of homozygosity substantially higher than typically seen in modern human populations, even modern human populations known to have gone through significant historical bottlenecks. Further analysis, including detailed work published by K. Prufer and colleagues, found evidence consistent with extremely small local group sizes, in some cases suggesting a Neanderthal individual's own parents may have been as closely related as half-siblings, or that the broader breeding population contributing to a given individual's ancestry numbered only in the dozens. This finding reframes the entire question of interbreeding in an important way. It is not simply the story of two healthy, thriving populations occasionally mixing at their borders. By the final tens of thousands of years of Neanderthal existence, at least in some regions, Neanderthal populations appear to have been small, fragmented, and biologically under strain, showing genetic evidence consistent with reduced fertility, increased vulnerability to disease, and reduced capacity to adapt to environmental change, all common consequences of long-term small population size and inbreeding in any species. Small, genetically strained populations facing an expanding, more numerous neighboring population create a very different context for interbreeding than two large, stable, evenly matched populations meeting as equals. Some researchers, including population geneticists analyzing these patterns, have suggested that Neanderthal populations in their final millennia may have been increasingly likely to seek partners outside their own immediate, shrinking group, whether because local partners were scarce, because inbreeding depression, was reducing the health and fertility of Neanderthal-Neanderthal pairings, or because smaller, weakened Neanderthal groups were being progressively absorbed into larger modern human populations as the two came into repeated contact across an expanding modern human presence in Europe and Western Asia. Comparative genetic analysis across Neanderthal remains from different regions has begun to reveal just how fragmented these late-period populations had become, with genomes recovered from sites in Western Europe, Central Europe, and the Altai region of Siberia, showing meaningfully different levels of genetic diversity and different degrees of relatedness to each other, suggesting these were not tightly interconnected populations regularly exchanging partners across their full range, but a patchwork of smaller, increasingly isolated groups, each experiencing their own localized version of the same underlying demographic squeeze. A Neanderthal group in what is now France, based on this evidence, would likely have had limited genetic contact with a Neanderthal group in the Altai Mountains for many thousands of years before either population encountered modern humans at all, meaning the pressures pushing individual Neanderthal groups towards seeking outside partners were probably operating somewhat independently in different regions, on different timelines, based on local population size and local encounter rates with expanding modern human groups, rather than as a single, coordinated, species-wide response to a single unified pressure. This regional variation matters because it means the interbreeding evidence discussed throughout this documentary likely represents an accumulation of many separate, smaller-scale local events, each shaped by the specific demographic circumstances of a particular Neanderthal group in a particular region at a particular time, rather than a single, uniform process playing out identically everywhere Neanderthals and modern humans happen to meet. Some local Neanderthal groups may have maintained relatively stable, larger population sizes for longer, with correspondingly less pressure towards seeking outside partners. Others, already reduced to the kind of small, closely related breeding groups suggested by the Altai genome discussed above, would have faced considerably stronger pressure, whether biological, social, or both, to look beyond their own shrinking community when modern human groups became available nearby. This does not mean every instance of interbreeding was driven by Neanderthal population decline specifically, since the genetic evidence discussed in Chapter 5 indicates interbreeding began considerably earlier, likely in the Levant, well before the most severe population decline evident in the latest Neanderthal genomes from Europe. But it does suggest that as the overall Neanderthal population became smaller, more fragmented, and more genetically strained across their final tens of thousands of years, the biological and possibly social pressure towards seeking partners outside a shrinking, inbred local group may have increased over time, adding an additional layer of explanation to why interbreeding, once it began, appears to have continued and possibly intensified in certain regions as Neanderthal numbers fell. There is a specific, measurable genetic consequence of this dynamic that researchers have identified in modern human genomes today, and it connects directly back to the interbreeding evidence itself. When geneticists compare the amount of Neanderthal ancestry present in the genome of the Oase individual, the roughly 40,000-year-old modern human with a Neanderthal ancestor within the previous 4 to 6 generations discussed in Chapter 5, against the amount of Neanderthal ancestry present in modern human genomes today, the percentage has actually decreased over time, from roughly 6 to 9% in the Oase individual down to the 1 to 2% typically seen in living people with non. This decline reflects natural selection gradually removing Neanderthal genetic variants that proved harmful when combined with a modern human genetic background, a process researchers describe as selection against Neanderthal ancestry, most thoroughly documented in analysis by Sriram Sankararaman, David Reich, and later refined by Fernando Racimo, and others mapping which specific genomic regions were most strongly selected against. Certain regions of the modern human genome today are almost entirely free of Neanderthal ancestry, including large portions of the X chromosome and genes highly active in testis tissue, a pattern that researchers interpret as further evidence supporting the reduced hybrid male fertility hypothesis discussed in Chapter 6. Other regions involving genes related to immune response, skin pigmentation, and keratin production affecting hair and skin retain Neanderthal ancestry at levels higher than the genomic average, suggesting these particular inherited traits provided a genuine survival advantage to modern humans adapting to new, unfamiliar environments in Europe and Asia that Neanderthals had already occupied successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. A particularly striking example of this inbreeding pressure comes from a Neanderthal skeleton excavated at a cave in the Altai Mountains, analyzed alongside the Denisovan material discussed in Chapter 3. Genetic analysis of this individual, published by K. Prufer's team, found that her parents were closely related, likely at the level of half-siblings sharing one parent, or possibly an uncle and niece, or an aunt and nephew, a level of relatedness that in most human populations today would be considered a significant genetic risk factor for the resulting offspring. This was not presented by researchers as an unusual, isolated finding specific to one unlucky individual. It was presented as consistent with the broader pattern of small, fragmented Neanderthal group sizes suggested by other genomes analyzed from different sites and different time periods, indicating that close relative mating may have been a regular, if not universal, feature of Neanderthal reproduction in at least some regions and periods, simply as a consequence of small available group sizes rather than cultural preference. The health consequences of sustained inbreeding across many generations are well understood in modern population genetics, and they help explain why small Neanderthal populations, even without any direct pressure from modern humans, may have already been on an unstable trajectory. Inbreeding increases the likelihood that harmful recessive genetic variants, normally masked in a population with more genetic diversity because an individual is unlikely to inherit two copies of the same rare harmful variant from two unrelated parents, become expressed more frequently, since closely related parents are more likely to both carry and both pass on the same harmful variant. Over many generations, this process, known as inbreeding depression, tends to reduce fertility, increase vulnerability to disease, and reduce overall population resilience, exactly the pattern geneticists have identified when analyzing the accumulated genetic evidence from late-period Neanderthal populations across multiple sites. This is where the story completes an important circle. Interbreeding was not simply a byproduct of two populations existing near each other. It appears to have provided modern humans with a genuine biological toolkit, inherited directly from a population that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to exactly the environments modern humans were newly entering. In a very real, measurable sense, the genetic legacy of Neanderthals helped equip the population that would eventually replace them to survive in the very world Neanderthals had shaped their own bodies to fit. The final major piece of this investigation turns to the disappearance itself, the period during which Neanderthal populations declined to extinction across Europe and Western Asia, and to what the evidence suggests about how interbreeding, population decline, and eventual disappearance were connected, or in some cases, were not as directly connected as popular explanations often assume. Chapter 9. Did they disappear, or were they absorbed by approximately 40,000 years ago? The archaeological signature of distinct Neanderthal populations begins thinning across most of Europe. By roughly 35,000 years ago, based on the most recent reliable dating of confirmed Neanderthal remains, that signature disappears from the record almost entirely, with a few contested exceptions, including the later Iberian sites discussed in the previous chapter, where some researchers argue small Neanderthal populations may have persisted closer to 39 or 40,000 years ago before their final disappearance. For decades, popular explanations for this disappearance tended toward two competing narratives, each simple enough to fit neatly into a documentary running time far shorter than this one. The first narrative framed Neanderthal extinction as a story of violent replacement, modern humans arriving with superior weapons, superior organization, or superior cognitive ability, and directly outcompeting or eliminating Neanderthal populations through conflict or resource competition. The second narrative, gaining more traction as genetic evidence of interbreeding accumulated, framed Neanderthal disappearance not as extinction at all, but as absorption, the idea that Neanderthals did not truly die out so much as they were genetically folded into the expanding modern human population until no biologically distinct Neanderthal group remained. The honest, evidence-based answer, based on current research, does not fully support either narrative on its own, and instead suggests something closer to a combination of multiple, simultaneous pressures acting on an already vulnerable population. The genetic evidence discussed in the previous chapter, showing small, fragmented, increasingly inbred Neanderthal populations across their final tens of thousands of years, suggests Neanderthals were already in serious biological difficulty well before the period of most intense contact with expanding modern human populations. A small, inbred, genetically strained population faces elevated risk from factors that would be far less dangerous to a larger, more diverse population, including disease outbreaks, localized environmental shifts, and simple demographic bad luck, where a run of years with few surviving births could meaningfully threaten an already small group's long-term viability. Climate evidence adds another layer of pressure. The period of Neanderthal decline overlaps with significant climate instability in Europe, including rapid temperature fluctuations documented in ice core and sediment records analyzed by paleoclimatologists, including researchers working on Greenland ice core data correlated with European archaeological sites. Neanderthals were highly adapted specialists for Ice Age European conditions, and rapid climate swings, even ones that might seem modest by modern standards, could have significantly disrupted the specific ecosystems and prey populations Neanderthal groups depended on, adding further pressure to populations already weakened by small size and reduced genetic diversity. The Iberian Peninsula, mentioned briefly in the previous chapter as a possible late refuge for surviving Neanderthal populations, deserves closer attention here, because it illustrates how uneven and geographically staggered the overall decline actually was, rather than representing a single, simultaneous disappearance across the whole of Europe. Sites including Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, along with several other locations across southern Iberia, have produced Neanderthal remains and associated tool assemblages that some researchers, including Clive Finlayson, have dated to as recently as 32 to 28,000 years ago. Though these later dates remain contested by other researchers who argue the dating methods used, particularly radiocarbon dating applied to material from this period, are approaching the outer limits of their reliability and may be producing artificially young results due to contamination with more recent carbon. Even setting aside the most contested latest dates, more broadly accepted evidence still supports Iberia as one of the last regions where distinct Neanderthal populations persisted, likely surviving several thousand years longer than Neanderthal populations further north and east in Europe, where modern human populations had established themselves earlier and more thoroughly. This staggered pattern of decline, with different regional Neanderthal populations disappearing at different times across a span of several thousand years rather than all at once, supports the multi-causal explanation this chapter has been building. A single simultaneous cause, whether a single climate catastrophe or a single wave of violent replacement, would be expected to produce a more uniform disappearance pattern across the whole Neanderthal range at roughly the same time. The staggered, region-by-region pattern actually observed in the archaeological record fits much better with a combination of local factors, including local population size, local climate conditions, local competition with modern human groups, and, in regions like Iberia, possibly somewhat isolated by geography, from the earliest and most intense waves of modern human expansion, more time for the underlying demographic and genetic vulnerabilities discussed throughout this chapter to finally overwhelm an already fragile population. Direct competition with modern humans for shared resources, including prime hunting territory, cave shelters, and prey species, almost certainly played some role as well, particularly as modern human populations grew larger and more numerous across the same regions Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans arriving in Europe appear, based on archaeological evidence of tool complexity, projectile weapon technology, and evidence of long-distance trade networks and larger social groupings, to have organized in somewhat larger, more interconnected social networks than the smaller, more isolated Neanderthal groups suggested by the genetic evidence, potentially providing a demographic and logistical advantage in direct competition for the same limited resources, without requiring any assumption of direct violent conflict to explain a gradual competitive disadvantage. This organizational difference is worth explaining a little further, because it offers one more piece of context for understanding why interbreeding, rather than sustained separate coexistence, may have become an increasingly common outcome as the final millennia of Neanderthal presence in Europe unfolded. Archaeological evidence, including the discovery of ornamental materials and raw stone tool material transported across distances of many dozens or even hundreds of kilometers at some modern human sites from this period, suggests modern human groups maintained wider social networks, exchanging goods and very likely information and marriage partners across a broader geographic and social web than the more locally confined Neanderthal groups appear to have maintained, based on the more geographically restricted patterns of raw material use documented at most Neanderthal sites. A modern human group facing a bad season in one location may have had a wider network of allied or related groups to draw support from, an option a smaller, more isolated Neanderthal group in the same circumstances may not have had available to the same degree, adding yet another layer of pressure that would have made joining or merging with a nearby modern human group an increasingly practical option for a struggling late Neanderthal population, alongside whatever other social or personal factors may have been involved in any specific encounter. Where interbreeding fits into this combination of pressures is more nuanced than either the pure absorption or pure replacement narrative suggests. The genetic evidence indicates interbreeding happened, and happened repeatedly, but the actual percentage of Neanderthal ancestry surviving in modern human genomes today, roughly 1 to 2%, is far too small to support a claim that modern humans today are meaningfully part Neanderthal in any population-level sense that would qualify as absorption of the entire Neanderthal population into the modern human gene pool. If tens of thousands of Neanderthals across their final populations had been fully absorbed through widespread, generation after generation intermarriage, researchers would expect modern human genomes to carry a considerably higher percentage of Neanderthal ancestry than the 1 to 2% actually observed. Instead, the evidence suggests interbreeding was meaningful, and clearly happened often enough to leave a permanent, functionally significant genetic mark, without being the dominant, defining feature of contact between the two populations population-wide. It happened at the edges, in the borderlands, in the specific regions and specific generations where the two populations came into closest and most sustained contact, including the Levant in the earlier period of contact, and parts of Europe including Iberia in the later period. While the great majority of both populations across their respective ranges likely had limited or no direct contact with the other at all during any given generation. This more complicated picture, part demographic decline, part climate pressure, part resource competition, and part interbreeding concentrated in specific regions and periods rather than spread evenly across the whole of both populations, is less satisfying as a single dramatic story than either the replacement narrative or the absorption narrative. But it is the picture that current evidence, weighed honestly across genetics, archaeology, and paleoclimatology, actually supports. Neanderthals did not simply lose a war to modern humans. They did not simply dissolve peacefully into the modern human gene pool through universal intermarriage. They experienced a slow, multi-causal decline, in which interbreeding was a real, documented, biologically significant part of the story, concentrated in specific times and places, alongside population fragility, climate pressure, and competitive disadvantage that together proved impossible for an already strained population to overcome. What survived in the specific, traceable form of Neanderthal DNA, carried by billions of people alive today, represents the one part of Neanderthal biology that did not disappear when the last distinct Neanderthal population died out somewhere in Iberia or elsewhere in Europe, roughly 35 to 40,000 years ago. It represents the genetic legacy of the interbreeding this documentary has traced from the Levant, through Denis's parentage in Siberia, through the asymmetric direction of genetic flow, through the possible hybrid child buried with care in Portugal, to the small inbred final Neanderthal populations whose remaining members, in some documented cases, appear to have sought partners across the boundary that separated their kind from ours. One additional consequence of interbreeding deserves attention here, because it demonstrates how directly the genetic legacy of contact between these two populations continues to shape human biology today, in ways most people carrying that legacy have never considered. Immune system genes, specifically a group called the human leukocyte antigen system, which plays a central role in how the body recognizes and responds to pathogens, show some of the clearest evidence of beneficial Neanderthal ancestry surviving in modern populations. Research led by Laurent Abi-Rached and Peter Parham found that certain Neanderthal-derived immune gene variants are present at unusually high frequencies in specific modern populations, particularly in parts of Asia, suggesting these variants provided a genuine, measurable survival advantage against local pathogens that Neanderthals, after hundreds of thousands of years in Eurasia, had already evolved some resistance to, while modern human populations newly arriving from Africa had not. This finding carries a certain grim logic that connects back to the population pressure discussed earlier in this chapter. Small, mobile modern human groups moving into unfamiliar Eurasian environments would have faced immediate exposure to unfamiliar diseases, parasites, and pathogens that local Neanderthal populations had already been living alongside and adapting to for hundreds of thousands of years. In this specific narrow sense, interbreeding functioned as a kind of accelerated adaptation, allowing modern human populations to inherit disease resistance that would otherwise have taken many thousands of years of independent evolution to develop through natural selection, acting on modern human genetic variation alone. Whatever the circumstances of any individual encounter between a Neanderthal and a modern human, the aggregate genetic consequence, playing out across thousands of years and measured today in the immune systems of billions of people, was a meaningful survival advantage passed from a population in the process of disappearing to the population that would remain. This detail reframes the disappearance discussed throughout this chapter in one final, important way. Neanderthal populations did decline, fragment, and eventually vanish as a biologically distinct group. But the framing of pure extinction, a population reduced to zero with nothing surviving, is not fully accurate given everything this documentary has traced. A meaningful, measurable, still-functioning portion of Neanderthal biology persists, actively shaping immune response, skin and hair characteristics, and other traits in the majority of people alive on the planet today. Extinction, in the strict sense of a population's genetic lineage ending completely, did not fully happen. Something rarer and more complicated happened instead. A population declining to the point of disappearance as a distinct group, while simultaneously contributing a permanent, functional inheritance to the population that displaced them. The final chapter turns to what all of this evidence, taken together across every line of investigation this documentary has followed, actually allows us to responsibly conclude about the original question: did Neanderthals fall in love like us? And what, precisely, the accumulated evidence can and cannot say about the answer. Chapter 10. What a brain built like ours can feel. Every line of evidence this documentary has followed so far describes what Neanderthals did. Bones healed after severe injury. Children of mixed ancestry survived to adolescence and received careful burial. Genetic material passed between populations repeatedly across tens of thousands of years. But behavior alone, however suggestive, does not fully answer the question of internal experience. To ask whether Neanderthals could feel something recognizable as love requires looking at one more category of evidence: the physical structure of the Neanderthal brain and body systems most closely associated, in modern humans, with attachment, bonding, and emotional experience. Neanderthal brain volume, estimated from skull endocasts recovered at multiple sites, was on average slightly larger than modern human brain volume, though brain size alone tells researchers relatively little about specific cognitive or emotional capacity, since brain size correlates only loosely with intelligence or emotional complexity across different species and even within modern humans today. What has proven more informative is the shape and internal organization of the Neanderthal brain, reconstructed through detailed analysis of skull interior surfaces by researchers including Emiliano Brunner, who has compared Neanderthal endocasts against modern human endocasts using three-dimensional imaging techniques. This research has identified some differences in relative proportions, particularly involving the parietal lobe region and cerebellum, areas associated in modern humans with aspects of social cognition, spatial processing, and certain forms of complex thought. Researchers debate what these proportional differences actually mean functionally, since brain shape differences do not translate directly and predictably into specific behavioral or emotional differences, and the debate over how much weight to give these anatomical distinctions remains genuinely unresolved within the field. What is not in serious scientific dispute is that Neanderthals possessed the same basic underlying neural architecture as modern humans, including brain regions associated with emotional processing, memory, and social bonding that are broadly conserved across all humans and indeed across many mammal species more generally. More directly relevant to the specific question of attachment and bonding is genetic evidence involving a gene called oxytocin receptor, along with related genes involved in the regulation of oxytocin and vasopressin. hormones strongly associated across many mammal species, including modern humans, with pair bonding, parental attachment, and social trust. Comparative genetic analysis of the Neanderthal genome, conducted as part of the broader genome sequencing projects discussed throughout this documentary, has found that Neanderthals carried functioning versions of the core genes involved in this hormonal system, largely similar to the versions carried by modern humans, with some minor variants whose functional significance researchers are still working to fully characterize. This finding matters because oxytocin and vasopressin signaling represents one of the most well-studied biological systems underlying attachment behavior across mammals. From the pair bonding behavior observed in prairie voles, studied extensively by researchers including Larry Young, to parent-infant attachment and adult romantic attachment in modern humans. The presence of a functioning, broadly similar version of this hormonal system in Neanderthals does not prove they experienced romantic love identical to the modern human experience, since human romantic attachment involves complex cultural, cognitive, and social factors layered on top of basic hormonal mechanisms, factors that cannot be directly observed in an extinct population known only through skeletal and genetic remains. But it does establish that Neanderthals possessed the basic biological machinery associated with attachment and bonding in every other closely studied mammal species, including modern humans, rather than lacking it or possessing a fundamentally different system. The comparative animal research underlying this finding deserves a brief note, because it illustrates just how deeply conserved this particular biological system is across very different species, which in turn strengthens the inference that Neanderthals, sharing a common human ancestor with modern humans as recently as several 100,000 years ago, almost certainly used this same system for broadly similar social purposes. Prairie voles, a small rodent species studied for decades specifically because of their unusual monogamous pair bonding behavior, rare among rodents generally, show measurable increases in oxytocin and vasopressin activity during mating and pair formation, and researchers have demonstrated experimentally that blocking these hormone receptors disrupts pair bond formation, while artificially increasing receptor activity can induce bonding behavior even outside the normal mating context. This system, first mapped in detail in a species as evolutionarily distant from humans as a small rodent, is not unique to primates or to humans specifically. It represents a deep, ancient piece of mammalian biology, present in some form across a huge range of species, that happens to have been elaborated in different directions by different evolutionary lineages, including the lineage shared by Neanderthals and modern humans right up until their separation several 100,000 years ago. Combined with the behavioral evidence discussed throughout this documentary, sustained care for severely injured group members at Neanderthal Cave, careful burial practices extending, in at least the contested case of the Lagarvelho child, to children of possible mixed ancestry, and the demonstrated capacity to raise a first-generation hybrid child to adolescence, in the case of Denny, a coherent picture emerges that is more precise and more genuinely interesting than either extreme this documentary opened with. Neanderthals were not incapable of anything resembling attachment, requiring us to explain interbreeding purely through coercion or opportunism. The physical and genetic evidence for their capacity to care for vulnerable members of their own group, to raise mixed ancestry children, and to possess the same core biological systems underlying attachment behavior in every closely related species, makes that extreme position difficult to defend against the actual evidence. At the same time, the evidence does not support a fully romanticized narrative in which every documented instance of interbreeding involved a story resembling a modern courtship, complete with mutual pursuit and enduring exclusive partnership. The genetic asymmetry discussed in Chapter 6 the population pressure and demographic vulnerability discussed in Chapter 8, and the simple fact that direct evidence of internal emotional experience cannot be recovered from bones or genomes, all require the documentary to stop short of that fuller romantic claim, however satisfying it might feel to make. What the evidence responsibly supports, gathered across genetics, skeletal analysis, comparative brain anatomy, and hormonal biology, is this: Neanderthals possessed the biological capacity for attachment. They demonstrated, in multiple independently excavated cases across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, sustained care extended toward vulnerable individuals, including at least one documented case of a mixed ancestry child. And the genetic record shows that whatever happened between Neanderthal and modern human individuals across their long period of overlapping territory, it happened often enough and successfully enough to leave a permanent, measurable trace inside the majority of human beings alive on the planet today. One further piece of evidence bears directly on the question of whether Neanderthals could have formed the kind of communicative bond that human attachment, in any recognizable sense, generally requires. Language leaves no direct physical trace, and no recording of Neanderthal speech will ever be recovered. But researchers have examined indirect anatomical evidence bearing on the question of whether Neanderthals were physically capable of complex spoken communication. A hyoid bone, a small, delicate bone in the throat that anchors muscles involved in speech and swallowing, recovered from the Neanderthova Cave Neanderthal skeleton discussed earlier in this documentary, was found to be nearly identical in shape to a modern human hyoid bone, a finding published by researchers including Baruch Arensberg and reanalyzed with more advanced methods by Bruce Latimer, who concluded through biomechanical modeling that Neanderthal hyoid function likely supported vocal capabilities broadly similar to modern humans. Separately, analysis of the FOXP2 gene, strongly linked in modern humans to speech and language development, found that Neanderthals carried a version of this gene very similar to the modern human variant, differing from the ancestral version found in chimpanzees and other great apes, a finding first published by researchers including Wolfgang Ennard and Parbo's team. Neither the hyoid bone evidence nor the FOXP2 evidence proves Neanderthals possessed language identical in complexity to modern human language, since language capability depends on far more than a single gene or a single bone, involving complex brain structures and learned cultural transmission that cannot be directly measured from skeletal or genetic remains alone. But together, this evidence makes it considerably more difficult to defend the older assumption that Neanderthals were incapable of anything resembling complex communication, an assumption that once served as one of the main arguments against the idea that Neanderthals could have formed relationships with modern humans involving anything beyond basic, wordless interaction. If Neanderthals possessed some meaningful capacity for spoken communication, the possibility of an actual relationship between a Neanderthal and a modern human individual, involving shared understanding built over time rather than a single wordless encounter, becomes considerably more plausible than it would if the two populations had no shared means of communication at all. This does not mean a Neanderthal and a modern human partner spoke fluently to each other in a shared language. Their vocal and linguistic traditions had developed separately for hundreds of thousands of years, and any communication between individuals from the two populations meeting for the first time would likely have involved considerable difficulty, relying heavily on gesture, demonstration, and the gradual, patient building of shared understanding that characterizes contact between any two groups without a common language, a process well documented in more recent historical contact between previously isolated human populations. But the underlying biological capacity for that kind of gradual, sustained, communicative relationship rather than a permanent and total communication barrier, appears to have existed on both sides. Whether every one of those encounters involved something a modern person would recognize and call love, the evidence cannot say with certainty, and any documentary claiming otherwise would be overstating what bones and genes can actually tell us. But the evidence does say, with considerably more confidence than researchers could have offered even 15 years ago, that Neanderthals were biologically and behaviorally capable of it, that the social structures required to sustain that kind of bond existed within their communities, and that at least some of those bonds, whatever their precise emotional texture, proved durable enough to produce children, raise them, and, improbably, leave a piece of an extinct species alive inside nearly every person reading or hearing this sentence today. Conclusion. Return for a moment to that cave above the river valley in Croatia, and to the woman whose bones started this investigation. She lived, by the best current estimates, somewhere between 40 and 42,000 years ago. She died in a world that still contained two kinds of humans, hers and ours, moving across shared and bordering territory, sometimes near enough to trade a technique for shaping stone, sometimes near enough to raise a child together. We do not know her name, her voice, or the specific shape of her daily life. We know what her bones and her genome can tell us, and across the length of this investigation, that has proven to be considerably more than researchers could say with confidence even 2 decades ago. We know that people like her carried a functioning biological system for attachment, largely similar to the one every person watching this documentary carries today. We know that people like her lived in groups capable of sustaining a severely injured adult for years, at real cost to the group's own survival. We know that at least one child born from a Neanderthal parent, and a parent from a closely related, different population, survived long enough to leave a bone fragment behind in a cave in Siberia. And we know that somewhere, in some encounter this evidence cannot fully reconstruct, a person like her, and a person like the modern humans, expanding into her territory, had a child whose descendants are, quite possibly, alive today, carrying a small, permanent piece of her population forward into a future she could never have imagined. The title of this documentary asked a direct question: did Neanderthals fall in love like us? The honest answer, built from everything the evidence actually shows rather than what would make the most satisfying story, is that we cannot know with certainty what any specific Neanderthal felt toward any specific partner, any more than a future researcher, working only from bone and genetic fragments tens of thousands of years from now, could reconstruct the precise emotional texture of a single modern relationship from skeletal remains alone. What we can say, responsibly and with growing scientific confidence, is that Neanderthals possessed everything required to feel something recognizable as love: the neural architecture, the hormonal systems, the demonstrated social capacity for sustained, costly care, the willingness, shown repeatedly across multiple sites and multiple thousands of years, to raise children who did not fit neatly into a single category. That is not the same as proof that every encounter between our two populations was gentle, chosen, or equal. The genetic asymmetry this documentary traced in Chapter 6 remains a real and unresolved complication, one that resists a simple romantic conclusion. The population pressures documented in Chapter 8 remind us that some of this contact happened as a small, struggling population faced a larger, expanding one, a context that rarely produces uniformly equal relationships in any period of human history, ancient or recent. A responsible account of the past has to hold both of these truths at once: the capacity for genuine attachment and the uncomfortable context in which some of that attachment likely occurred, without collapsing either one into the other for the sake of a cleaner story. What remains after all the genetic sequencing, all the skeletal analysis, and all the careful, contested scholarly debate this documentary has followed is something quietly extraordinary. Somewhere between 47 and 65,000 years ago, and at several points afterward in several different regions, members of two different, closely related kinds of humans, each shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution, found each other closely enough, and often enough, to have children who survived. Those children were raised. Some of them were buried with the same care given to every other child in their community, and their descendants carried a small, permanent inheritance forward, through tens of thousands of years, through the end of the Ice Age, through the rise and fall of every civilization that followed, until it reached you, or reached someone you have shaken hands with, or reached nearly every person of non-African ancestry currently alive on this planet. You do not need to romanticize the past to find that fact remarkable. You do not need to invent dialogue between two people who left no words behind, or imagine a courtship the evidence cannot confirm, to recognize that something durable passed between two kinds of humans who are no longer both here. Somewhere in a genome sequenced from a fragment of bone, and somewhere, quite possibly, in your own genome, a piece of that ancient contact survives, not as a story anyone chose to tell, but as a fact your own body has been carrying all along, whether you ever ask the question or not. Consider what that means the next time you notice a family resemblance passed down through generations. A grandmother's eyes in a granddaughter's face, a father's build inherited by a son who never met him. Human inheritance rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, through blood and bone, long after the people who created it are gone. The Neanderthal woman whose bones opened this documentary passed something forward without ever knowing she had done it, without any record, without any name we can recover, and without any certainty about what she felt in the moment that made it possible. 42,000 years later, that inheritance is still here, still functioning, still shaping the immune systems, the skin, and quite possibly the emotional lives of people who will never know her name either. That is not a small thing. It may be the closest thing to a love letter that prehistory left behind, written not in words, but in the shared architecture of every human body that carries it forward, waiting patiently and quietly for someone to finally ask the honest question and follow the evidence far enough to hear the real answer.